Amber stood at the edge of the massive underground maze, her heart pounding in her chest. The dimly lit entrance loomed before her, a gaping maw ready to swallow her whole. She glanced around at the other contestants, each one looking as nervous as she felt. They were a motley crew of desperate souls, all hoping to escape their dire circumstances with the promise of a life-changing prize. Amber, a 19-year-old college dropout, had nothing left to lose. Her once bright future had crumbled under the weight of student loans and a series of unfortunate events. This game, twisted as it was, seemed like her last chance. Mr. Beast, the reclusive tech mogul who had orchestrated this nightmare, appeared on a giant screen above the entrance. His face was a mask of cold amusement as he explained the rules. "Welcome to the ultimate challenge," he said, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. "You have 24 hours to navigate the maze and reach the center. The first one to do so will win enough money to change their life forever. But be warned, this maze is filled with deadly traps, poisonous gas, and vicious creatures. Only the strongest will survive." Amber took a deep breath and stepped into the maze. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The walls were lined with jagged rocks, and the floor was uneven, making every step treacherous. She could hear the distant sounds of other contestants moving through the labyrinth, their footsteps echoing eerily in the darkness. As she ventured deeper into the maze, Amber's anxiety grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She knew Mr. Beast was monitoring their every move from his control room, gleefully manipulating the environment to create maximum carnage for his online audience. The thought made her skin crawl. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. Amber's heart raced as she quickened her pace, desperate to put as much distance as possible between herself and whatever had caused that scream. She rounded a corner and nearly stumbled over a body. It was one of the contestants, a young man with a mop of curly hair. His eyes were wide open, frozen in a look of sheer terror. His body was contorted in an unnatural position, and blood pooled around him, seeping into the cracks in the floor. Amber gagged, her stomach churning at the sight. She forced herself to keep moving, knowing that stopping would only make her an easier target. She had to stay focused if she wanted to survive. Hours passed in a blur of fear and adrenaline. Amber encountered several more traps, each one more gruesome than the last. She narrowly avoided a pit filled with spikes, and she managed to hold her breath long enough to escape a chamber filled with poisonous gas. Her clothes were torn, and her body was covered in cuts and bruises, but she pressed on. Eventually, she stumbled upon a small group of survivors. There were 4 of them: a tall, muscular man named Jack, a wiry, nervous-looking woman named Lisa, a middle-aged man with a grizzled beard named Tom, and a young girl with wide, frightened eyes named Emily. They eyed Amber warily as she approached, but they seemed relieved to see another friendly face. "We need to stick together," Jack said, his voice low and urgent. "It's the only way we'll make it through this." Amber nodded, grateful for the company. They formed an uneasy alliance, each one wary of the others, but understanding the necessity of cooperation. As they moved through the maze, they shared what little supplies they had and took turns keeping watch while the others rested. Despite their best efforts, paranoia began to creep in. The constant threat of danger and the knowledge that only one of them could win the prize weighed heavily on their minds. Tensions ran high, and arguments broke out over the smallest things. Trust was a fragile commodity, easily shattered by the ever-present fear. As they huddled together in a small alcove, Amber couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She glanced around at her companions, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a makeshift torch. Jack's eyes were hard and calculating. Lisa's hands trembled uncontrollably. Tom's jaw was clenched in silent determination, and Emily's wide eyes darted nervously from one person to the next. Amber's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything she had ever heard. The group tensed, their eyes scanning the darkness for the source of the sound. Without warning, a monstrous creature lunged at them from the shadows. It was a grotesque hybrid of human and animal, its body covered in matted fur and its eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. The creature attacked with ferocious speed, its claws slashing through the air. Jack fought back with all his strength, but the creature was too powerful. It tore into him, ripping flesh from bone with sickening ease. Blood sprayed across the walls, and Jack's screams echoed through the maze. Lisa and Tom tried to fend off the creature, but they were no match for its brutality. Lisa was thrown against the wall, her head cracking against the stone with a sickening thud. Tom was impaled on the creature's claws, his body convulsing in agony before going limp. Amber grabbed Emily's hand and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the creature's snarls and the sounds of its pursuit growing fainter as they put distance between themselves and the massacre. They didn't stop until they were sure they were safe. As they caught their breath, Amber realized they were in a part of the maze she hadn't seen before. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the air was thick with an oppressive sense of dread. She knew they had to keep moving, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They continued through the maze, their progress slow and cautious. Amber's mind raced with thoughts of betrayal and survival. She knew she couldn't trust anyone, not even Emily. The young girl was a liability, and Amber couldn't afford to be weighed down. As they approached what seemed to be the center of the maze, Amber's suspicions were confirmed. She found a hidden room filled with monitors and control panels. It was Mr. Beast's control room, the heart of his twisted game. Amber's blood ran cold as she realized the extent of his sadistic machinations. He had been watching them the entire time, manipulating the maze to maximize their suffering. Amber's mind raced as she formulated a plan. She knew she had to expose Mr. Beast and his horrific game to the world. She couldn't let him get away with this. But first, she had to survive. She turned to Emily, her expression hardening. "Stay here," she said, her voice cold and unfeeling. "I'll be back." Emily's eyes widened with fear and confusion, but she nodded, too scared to argue. Amber steeled herself and entered the control room, her heart pounding in her chest. Mr. Beast was there, his back turned to her as he monitored the maze. Amber crept up behind him, her hands shaking with a mix of fear and determination. She grabbed a heavy metal pipe from the floor and raised it above her head. Before she could strike, Mr. Beast turned, a cruel smile on his face. "I knew you'd make it this far," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You're stronger than the others." Amber's grip tightened on the pipe, her knuckles white. "This ends now," she said through gritted teeth. Mr. Beast laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "You really think you can stop me? You're just a pawn in my game." Amber swung the pipe with all her strength, but Mr. Beast was ready. He dodged the blow and grabbed her by the throat, his grip like iron. Amber struggled, her vision blurring as she fought for breath. In a desperate move, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small knife she had found earlier in the maze. She plunged it into Mr. Beast's side, the blade sinking deep into his flesh. He roared in pain and released her, clutching at the wound. Amber staggered back, gasping for air. She knew she had to finish this. She lunged at Mr. Beast, the knife still in her hand. They struggled, their bodies colliding with brutal force. Blood flowed freely, staining the floor. With a final, desperate effort, Amber drove the knife into Mr. Beast's heart. He gasped, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing before going still. Amber stood over him, her chest heaving with exertion. She had done it. She had survived. But as she looked around the control room, the reality of her situation sank in. She was still trapped in the maze, and there was no way out. She turned to the monitors, her eyes scanning the screens. She saw Emily, still waiting where she had left her, and the bodies of the other contestants scattered throughout the maze. The horror of what she had endured washed over her, and she sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. In the end, Amber had survived Mr. Beast's deadliest game, but the cost was too high. She was forever changed, haunted by the memories of the maze and the blood she had spilled. The prize money meant nothing to her now. All she wanted was to escape the darkness that had consumed her soul.